Well, good evening, everybody. Thank you for listening to another Bible class here at Marion Street Church of Christ. This is an exciting Sunday because it's our first Sunday of the year, and we spent all morning at Marion Street Church of Christ talking about our new theme and catching everyone up with some plans for the year and some plans for Bible classes. And so I'm going to take just a second and I'm going to catch everyone else up with what we have going on over the next several months. It's hard to plan for this year because we still don't know exactly what is going to happen over the next several months. And so we're kind of taking this just one step at a time. But the plan is, as we unveiled this morning, our theme for the year is down but not out. It comes from 2 Corinthians chapter 4 and verse 7, where Paul talks about there how sometimes we get knocked down, but that doesn't mean we need to stay out. And so you can go and listen to this morning's lesson on that to get caught up. But our theme for the year is down but not out. We've all had that kind of year in 2020 where it's just knocked us down. It feels like we got punched square in the mouth and we've been lying on our backs. We took a year off. Well, it's time to get up. It's time to get back going and get busy again, get busy with our spiritual lives, start rebuilding what we lost last year. Just because we were knocked down doesn't mean we need to stay down. We're going to get back up. We're going to keep fighting harder than ever. And so over the next several weeks, we're going to continue with our schedule that we really fell into a groove in the last part of the year last year. And that is Sunday nights will continue to be online here, and we will record those studies and air them live on Sundays. And then we will continue with a brand new class on Wednesdays. And that just is because we're meeting in person on Wednesdays. We have different audiences that tune into the online versus being in person. And so we're going to continue with a separate class on Wednesdays. We'll have more information on that coming up. This Wednesday, however, will be a singing to give some of our teachers some time in our kids' classes to redecorate, to clean, and do all those fun things. So let's get into our Sunday night study. Tonight is going to be a lot of introductory material. In fact, if you were following along on our Sunday night classes all last year in our big picture of the Bible, where we just kind of walked through the Bible book by book, some of this is going to be very familiar to you. And that is because what we are doing is we are going to be going over the books of Ezra and Nehemiah. I'll explain why in just a few moments, why we chose these two books to start our year with. But as you remember, what we did last Sunday or on Sunday nights last year is we just walked through our scriptures looking at book by book. And when we got to Ezra and Nehemiah, we looked at those books together. They go together for a very specific reason, as we'll get into. And what you'll also see tonight is we're going to do them together because it goes right along with our theme. And so Ezra and Nehemiah will be our study for the next 13 weeks, again, only on Sunday nights. So we invite you to follow along right here on Facebook Live, where you can ask your questions. I'm watching along with you. This is pre-recorded during the week, but I air this live. I follow with you, and so I'm looking at comments, I'm looking at questions, and so if something does come up, I know this isn't interactive where I can answer your question on the video. However, I can always answer your question in the comments, or you can send us a message if you like our Facebook page as well. So let's open up to the book of Ezra, and I'll explain some things before we get started here. But the book of Ezra and Nehemiah were chosen for a very specific purpose to start out our year. And that is because of what our theme is. All of our classes here at Marion Street Church of Christ try to go along with our theme for the year. And our theme again this year is down but not out. Well, when you think of Ezra and Nehemiah and the purpose of those books and the history that they're unfolding there, that's exactly what the children of Israel were going through. So just to give a little background before we get into, our traditional who, what, when, where, why, that's what this class is going to be tonight. Starting next week, we'll actually get into the chapters. And again, this is not big picture of the Bible. Tonight will be similar to big picture of the Bible because it's the introductory material. But starting next week, we'll actually get into the chapters. And we have just enough time in these 13 weeks between these two books to go 2 chapters a week. So it's going to be very simple. Chapters 1 and 2 next week, the week after that, 3 and 4, 5 and 6, and so on and so on. So we'll get into those chapters and more word for word and thought for thought starting next week. But tonight we'll do some introductory material. But again, these were chosen for a very specific purpose, with our theme being down but not out, and the idea of just being knocked on our backs, and it's time to get ourselves back up and start pushing forward again, spiritually speaking. These two books encompass a lot of that heart and a lot of that soul that we're going to be talking about with our theme this year. And that's because, as we look at some of these background things, The children of Israel had been knocked down, and they've been knocked down hard. Remember, they had went into captivity as we closed First and Second Chronicles, Second Chronicles especially. They are in captivity. The northern kingdom has already been taken into captivity. The southern kingdom of Judah has just been taken into captivity by the Babylonians into Babylon. There we go. And so that's how Chronicles closes. Now Ezra picks up several years later as people are now able to return to Jerusalem. So the Babylonians took the children of Israel into captivity. And through world history and world events, the Persians came and they took over the Babylonians. Well, Babylonians and Persians had very different mindsets on how to rule their people. The Babylonians would really, they took hostages, but if they took hostages, as they did in the children of Israel's case, we call them captives or pilgrims, anything like that, they would take them back to their homeland and they would become servants. That's like what we see with Daniel. Remember the story of Daniel where the Babylonians took over Judah and they took Daniel and several people. We see some of his friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They are taken and they become servants in the king's court, and they fill these jobs and they become slaves, so to speak. So the Babylonians were very ruthless in that way. Well, the Persians were very different. The Persians allowed people to live and stay in their hometowns, in their countries. They allowed them to worship their own gods. However, they had to pledge their allegiance to Persia. And so they were still under Persian rule. They pledged their allegiance to Persia, but they were able to go home, stay home, worship their own gods, as long as they would also, again, have their allegiance with Persia as well. So you see a transition starting to happen with Ezra and Nehemiah, where the Babylonians have been taken over by Persia, and so Persia is now allowing the captives and the slaves that were taken out of Israel to now return to Israel. Well, of course, when they return to Israel, they are left with a mess. And the people that had to stay in Jerusalem and the surrounding area, they were just kind of left in desolation. And now you have these groups returning to Jerusalem and to Israel, to Judah, and they are left with just devastation. The surrounding nations have kind of infiltrated, and they started to take over that land. You have the temple in ruins. You have the city of Jerusalem laying in ruins. No one had been able to rebuild it, and so they have a mess on their hands. And that's what we're going to see start to unfold through these two books, is we're going to see how they go from a group of people who had really been knocked out of history's equation to starting to become relevant again. And not only becoming relevant again, but how to build their nation from the ground up, quite literally, because as they get there, they have no temple, they have no city, they have no homes, they have no walls to protect them from surrounding nations. And so they had to take their nation of Israel and learn how to build it back up again. And so it goes perfectly with our theme, down but not out. They had been knocked down. They had been knocked out of the equation, spiritually speaking, historically speaking. Israel was on, they were flatlining there, laying in the hospital bed. But as God always does with his people, he can bring them back from the depths. And that's really the theme of these two books. God is in control. God brings them back from the depths and makes them a strong, powerful nation again through the rebuilding process. And so we're going to look at lots of different things this quarter about how they rebuilt. But then more importantly, what I want to do is not just look at the word for word stories in Ezra and Nehemiah. I want to pull out those principles and bring them into our lives so that we could see how important it is, I believe, to rebuild and to start that rebuilding process in 2021, because 2020 was so difficult. So I invite you to follow along this quarter, and I think it will be very beneficial to you. So let's start looking at Ezra and Nehemiah. What I'm going to do tonight, I've really kind of laid some of the groundwork already. Just some quick introductory things before we get started in the text next week with Ezra 1 and 2. But just look at some things together. So I'm going to do the introduction for Ezra and Nehemiah together tonight because they are so similar. and it's not worth repeating halfway through the class. So we're going to finish Ezra. I'm looking at my schedule right now, about the first or second week of February, and it's not worth taking an extra class just to go over the introduction of Nehemiah when it's so similar to Ezra. So we're going to do them both together right now. Then that will just leave us going straight through the text as it's written in one story, as one story. And that's where we're going to start. This is one story. In fact, Ezra and Nehemiah, it's a little confusing because when you get to Nehemiah 1 verse 1, it says the words of Nehemiah, the son of Hakaliah. Well, a lot of people interpret that Nehemiah is the author of Nehemiah. And that's just probably not the case. Nehemiah most likely did not write Nehemiah. Now, why would it say the words of Nehemiah? Because whoever the author is, which we'll get into that in just a moment, he probably did what several other Old and New Testament authors did, and that was either interview the sources or collect letters, which we'll see in a moment as well, collect letters from different sources, or use certain persons' stories in the storytelling, which when you get to Nehemiah chapter 1, those become Nehemiah's stories, and we'll see why in just a moment. But at the very beginning, since we have record and everything, Ezra and Nehemiah were pictured as one book, and they were one composition. They weren't considered two separate books. And they were combined as one from very early on. In fact, Josephus is a very well-known Christian historian, lived from 37 to about 100 AD, I believe. So very, very soon after the times of Christ. But he referred to the book of Ezra as one and not separate. And the oldest manuscripts, like the Septuagint, which is a Greek translation of the Old Testament, they also treat Ezra and Nehemiah as one book. Origen, who is, again, a very well-known Christian historian as well, he was the first writer to separate the books and to distinguish between two different books, but he still called them First Ezra and Second Ezra. So he still didn't attribute Nehemiah to Nehemiah being the author. It was First Ezra and Second Ezra. And so in translating the Vulgate, the Latin Vulgate in late 300s, early 400s, Jerome called Nehemiah the second book of Ezra. The English translations by Wycliffe and Coverdale, they all called Ezra First Ezra and Nehemiah Second Ezra, or Esdras in their language. And the same separation, just carried throughout. Well, eventually what happened was people just started calling it, well, these are the words in Nehemiah. So this is Ezra's story and Nehemiah's story. Well, Ezra most likely wrote both. So when we look at the authorship, we are seeing that Ezra most likely wrote both. Now, they're also closely related with First and Second Chronicles. Most likely, First and Second Chronicles was written by Ezra as well. Again, you have somebody at the end of Second Chronicles who talks about captivity. So someone had to have written the history of the people, probably not while it was happening, obviously, because that's several years to live through, and Ezra didn't live through all those years. But as any good historian, he could have gotten the facts from the records and from other people's writings or stories, and continued his story after Chronicles into the book of Ezra. Well, Chronicles was the beginning of their captivity. You have several years, 60 or 70 years before Ezra now takes place. And then he continues his story of now getting out of captivity. Just a little side note, it's interesting. Esther happens somewhere in the middle of all of this as well. So just some other books to kind of think about as you're going through some of the background. Is you have Ezra, you have Nehemiah, you have Esther happening in this time frame. You have also other a lot of the prophets who are going through this time frame as well. And so it's just interesting when you think about some of these, stories happening in the way they happen, unless you read it through chronologically, it's very difficult to get the understanding. But Ezra was a great historian. He includes several different lists through Ezra and Nehemiah that have been obtained from official sources. And so you look at some of them just to give you an idea, where he has the temple articles in verses 9 through 11 of Ezra chapter 1, where they're it's down to the number of dishes and the number of duplicates and the number of bowls and silver bowls and all these other things. Well, he has all the numbers. One such in verse 9, 29 duplicates. Well, that's interesting, because how would he know there was 29? Most likely got it from an official source. In chapter 2, you have the return of all the exiles. Again, the sons of, and then the heads of the houses, and then the exact number. Most likely came through official sources. And so he has several lists like this where, again, he's a historian and he's writing the history of the people. So he's writing for accuracy purposes. But he's getting these lists and including several lists that we'll see throughout our study over the next several weeks. Into Nehemiah, he gets lists about who helped rebuild the wall, those who sealed the covenant, the residents of Jerusalem and the surrounding towns. He has a list of the priests and the Levites. So very, very list-oriented, and gets those probably from official sources as he's reporting the history of these things. But again, it shows the similarity between Ezra and Nehemiah, how it was most likely one author that wrote these things. Also included in Ezra are several, I think it's 7 official documents or letters that we'll see throughout our time. You have different decrees, like the decree of Cyrus, in verse 2 of chapter 1, where it says, "Thus says Cyrus, the king of Persia," and then there's a quote there, you notice, where he quotes certain decrees and certain reports and certain letters, which is interesting as well, because again, as a historian, he would have gone for accuracy. And again, we see that through Ezra and Nehemiah. The writing styles are very similar. Ezra has several first-person extracts, probably from some memoirs, or as he's writing personal stories. So you notice in chapter 7 and chapter 8, you get some of that in the book of Ezra. And then you also have well, I'll give you an example of that. I meant to read an example of that. In Ezra 7, verses 27 and 28, if you look at verse 28, it says, "And has extended loving kindness to me before the king and his counselors." And so he's writing from a first-person perspective, but he also has other sections where he's writing in a third-person perspective. And so he's writing, from somebody else's perspective. Or also Nehemiah, he's doing the same thing, or writing Nehemiah's stories. And so most authors, most scholars believe that the author or compiler of Ezra and Nehemiah is the same as 1st and 2nd Chronicles, and that it's most likely believed to be Ezra, because he's compiling, just like Luke did. If you think about Luke in the New Testament, he compiled lots of other people's stories. He kind of went around and did his interviews, much like a news reporter would do today, or a historian would do. That's how we should view these books, as Ezra is the author, that someone who was compiling stories and historical facts and lists and decrees to give an accurate description of what the children of Israel had to go through. So when you think of that, you think of just everything that goes on in this story. It's not just a very quick little story. He's writing over several years, compiling all these stories together. So the date of this book is kind of hard to pinpoint between Ezra and Nehemiah. We do know that Ezra and Nehemiah both led a group of people back from captivity to Jerusalem, and that most likely happened. So the history of the people is Zerubbabel, which we'll get into here as well through Ezra and Nehemiah. Zerubbabel will lead the first group back in about the mid 500s, I would say. And so Ezra and Nehemiah follow him with 2 other groups of captives now coming back. So Zerubbabel is about 530, 536. And he was in charge of rebuilding the temple, and he led the first group back. Ezra would bring a second group back of captives to Jerusalem in 457 BC. So you're looking at about 70 to 80 years later, he would bring a group back after Zerubbabel. And then after that, you're looking at about 13 years later that Nehemiah would bring a third group back. And so these stories happen over years. And so that's important to understand as well. So when were these books written? It's very difficult to say because you have different groups coming back at different times. So is he writing them as they go? Is he looking back and writing them once they're all there? It's kind of difficult to piecemeal together. Most likely what most people try to attribute to dates is Ezra came first. Again, first part of the history, so it was completed first, maybe around 440, and then Nehemiah maybe around 430. Again, difficult to pinpoint exactly, but in those time frames, that would give, if Ezra brought his group back in 457 and Nehemiah brought his group back in 444, that would give the rebuilding process and the events some time to happen before they're being written down and circulated. So somewhere in that 430 BC to 440 BC time range, I think is appropriate. And again, we can line that up with historical facts now as we get into the Persian Empire and when some of these things happened in world history. And so we'll have more to say on their returns and when they happened and why they happened the way they did as we go through the book. So we're not going to get too much into that now. But I did want to, as we conclude tonight, to look at some of the major things we're going to look at. These books, Ezra and Nehemiah, they're kind of forgotten about books. They're very difficult in some places to read. In other places, they're very easy and you do get more of a storytelling mentality. But in some places, as I mentioned, there's lists. Ezra likes to write in lists, and that's very difficult to read through or very difficult to understand why it's so important to be added into these books. So what we're going to do through the course, as I said, is we're going to look at not only the books of Ezra and Nehemiah, but we're going to bring it back into some practical learning, some practical things for you and I on why this is so important for our theme, down but not out. And for instance, you look at the number of people like in Ezra chapter 2, and you'll notice if you have your Bibles open, starting in verse 2, you see the number of men of the people of Israel, and then it starts going in verse 3, and all the people that were turning in those certain households. And you get even down to verse 36, and the priests, the sons of Jedediah of the house of Jeshua, and then the priests returning, and then the Levites returning, and the singers, and it keeps going, and it just keeps listing all these families and all these names, and you might just be sitting there thinking, like, really, what's the point of this? Why do I need to know all these names that I can't really pronounce, like Reiah and Hagab and Akub and Keros and all these things where it's like, I don't know these people. I don't care about these people. I don't care that they're in the Bible. I don't care about these numbers. What are these numbers so important, right? 122, 128, 56, 3,630. Like, why do I care about these numbers? And the point that we're going to see over and over and over again is just how in control God is. And we're going to see over and over and over again the restoration of Israel from the time of exile to where this is being written and what's being done in this time period, and it's all God's doing. When we think there's no one left, when we think we're knocked down, when we think everyone's gone, we've been carried away into captivity, we've been knocked out, we're lying flat on our backs, look at what God made possible. Thousands of people were coming out of exile to return to Jerusalem. I mean, it's just an amazing story of what God is really capable of. You have the restoration of this great community, this great nation, and it's all God's doing, and it's all possible because of God. And so as we go through these stories, what we're going to do is we're going to look at that and say, well, here's why it's so important. Now these numbers and these names might not mean anything to us personally, but they should mean something to the story of God's people, which we are. That is, that God can do extraordinary things in our lives. And when we think we've been knocked out flat on our back like the year 2020 left us, it's time to get back up. And God is capable of bringing you back up and bringing you back and restoring you to not only what you once were, but maybe even stronger. And so we're going to look at those principles, a lot of those principles, as we go throughout the course of these two books on what God was able to do. Not only did he bring people back into Jerusalem and into the promised land, but he reestablished the covenant. Because, see, that's important. He brought them back to the promised land, brought them back to what he promised Abraham so long ago. And so he not only brings them back to the promised land, reestablishes the covenant, but he is reestablishing the city of David. He is reestablishing his temple. He's reestablishing temple worship. He's reestablishing his covenant with his people. And as you keep unfolding layer after layer of these two books, you're going to see that these two books are more than just historical markings through the children of Israel. That these have everything to do with the restoration of our spiritual lives, even here in the year 2021, as we try to pick up the pieces from the year before. So this entire series over this next quarter, as we look at Ezra and Nehemiah, is all going to be about restoration, restoring what we lost. And I hope to show you not only the history of God's people in the Old Testament time period, but I hope to show that history can repeat itself. And if God can take a captive people and bring them back and restore them into a great nation again, just imagine what he can do with you. And we live in one of the greatest countries in the world. I know it doesn't seem like that at times, but we live in the greatest country in the world. We are so blessed to live where we live. And we have everything at our disposal, right at our fingertips. And if God can take this lost group of people and bring them back again, imagine what he can do with you. And imagine the restoration that can happen in your life just by simply picking up his word, following along, and getting these Old Testament books dusted off for your New Testament life. That's our goal. That's our goal this next quarter, and I hope that helps you. So I'm excited to get into Ezra and Nehemiah. If you have any questions along the way, feel free to ask. Feel free to reach out. We are here for you. I know it was a difficult year last year, but we are excited, and we're looking forward to a brand new year as we try to restore ourselves. Our Sunday night study will be similar, something along these lines, but a lot more practical topics on how to rebuild certain areas of our lives, and we're looking forward to that study as well, but we'll have more information on that here in the next week or so. Hope you all have a great Sunday. Thank you for tuning in. We'll see you right back here next Sunday, where we're going to start in the book of Ezra, and we'll go over chapters 1 and 2 and have some great lessons for us in those first two chapters. Y'all have a great week, and we'll see you all soon.